I'm glad you're recording this, Sam, because I am going to make a couple of predictions today. And it'll be nice to be able to go back and see to what extent were these accurate. I remember back in 2019, I believe it was, right before COVID, when the US killed the commander of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Soleimani. And I remember that Ollie held a special panel, kind of an emergency panel about what that meant. And I said in that panel that I don't see how the US is not going to go to war with Iran at some point. So I remember like the room was a bit of a silence in the room when I said that because it seemed like a pretty outlandish thing to say. But I think I've always thought that the Iran situation is a hand grenade and it's going to blow up at some point. The question is which president will this hand grenade, who's going to be holding the grenade when it finally goes off, right? So and I think we are now in this situation. Now, one of the problems about this current conflict is that we don't really have much insight or much information from the US government about what the plan is. In fact, if you think about this, all we've had from the president is about kind of a 6 minute or so initial statement to the American people, which to me seemed more like a statement to the Iranian people than the American people, actually. His first, like a late night video, which was broadcast kind of like to coincide with the early morning of Iran, the Iranian kind of time zone, as opposed to because nobody was watching this like 1 o'clock in the morning US time or Eastern time. And we had like another follow-up, like a 3.5 or 4 minute video. Um, Hegseth gave a press conference, but he didn't really take many questions, and it was more like a statement. And in the State of the Union that the president gave, didn't really have anything about Iran, really. It was just he mentioned it once, I think. And that's pretty much it. So it's kind of difficult to figure out what the plan is here. The best I can do is I can say that this is sort of a phase one, it seems to me, of a longer kind of plan. Phase one probably is meant to last about 4 to 5, maybe 6 weeks. And the idea here is to attack the government of Iran and paralyze its nodes in a way, right? So that you take the time you need to paralyze the nodes, remove essentially the top 2 to 3 layers of the leadership of the government, mostly through assassinations. Here, by the way, I will note it's interesting how the war has changed in our lifetime. It used to be the case that when went to war in the old days, you didn't just immediately try to kill the other side's leader. That was seen kind of like a red line. Not anymore, as you can see, based on this and previous cases like the Maduro situation in Venezuela. Anyway, so that's phase one. Phase two, to me, it appears to be sort of an attempt to fracture the coherence of the regime and prevent it from regrouping and reorganizing, right? So prevent it from recovering from phase one. And this may last another 2 to 3 weeks. And then phase three of the plan is to encourage, and this has already started in a way, it's already been uttered by the White House, to encourage, a series of popular uprisings, both in the cities and urban centers, but also in the periphery. And by that I mean primarily in areas of Iran where you have a lot of ethnic divisions and separatist groups, which, by the way, I wouldn't be surprised if the CIA is currently arming. And I'm talking about the Kurds in the northwest and the Balochis, which is kind of like a non-Persian minority in the south that have secessionist aspirations. So, in other words, to try to pull the regime apart by inflaming polarized politics inside Iran, but also ethnic tensions. Phase four I think the administration, the United States administration, is hoping for some kind of prolonged, low intensity civil war that is going to fragment Iran and prevent it from focusing on outside actors, like, for example, Israel or Saudi Arabia, while also, and this is the important part here, trying to contain that war within the country's borders. So, in other words, a war that keeps Iran busy with itself without allowing it to escalate and become larger geographically than just Iran. And then phase five of the plan to me seems to be sort of ending up with some kind of like a secular government of sorts, not necessarily democratic, but definitely more secular than the current government that is willing to do business with Saudi Arabia, with the United States, and maybe even normalize relations with Israel. However, the end game here is particularly unclear. And I want to state this for the record. This is the second time in my lifetime that the US has gone to war, has sent its troops to war without explaining to them and to the American people clearly, right, what victory looks like. The first time this happened was in the Iraq War, where, well, actually, Iraq and Afghanistan, where basically we were told that we were going to a war on terror, as Bush Jr. called it, President Bush, which to me was completely nonsensical at the time and still is today. I mean, terror is an emotion, right? I think he meant terrorism, but for some reason, this kind of became corrupted to terror. So you go into war against an emotion, which is what is caused by terrorism, which is what basically I think he was again, I think he meant. But terrorism is a worldwide phenomenon that's been with us since the beginning of the dawn of the human race. So the possibility that your troops will be able to end terrorism, let alone terror in the world, is zero, right? So that's not a feasible call to arms. It would have been a lot more clear had we said we're going to fight Al Qaeda, the people who planned and executed 9/11, and when we finish that off, we'll be done. Instead, we went to a war that had no foreseeable end, and of course, it lasted 20 years. And I'm afraid that this is yet another such moment where we're going to war, we're sending American troops to a war that has no clear ending, no clear victory line, and I think that spells trouble. Now, some, of course, have been already talking about what is the reason for doing this. And then revisiting the Iraq War scenario that we all remember from back in 2003. I mean, Americans, I think, are very familiar with being given inaccurate reasons for going to war. And I think this is no exception. The official reason that we're given for going to war is to preempt some kind of Iranian conventional or unconventional attack that was supposed to be heading our way. But this doesn't stand to logic. At no point in our century has the Iranian government been more fragile and disheveled, and is hardly able to maintain its own presence within Iran, let alone seek to start wars with foreign powers. And not to mention that, the one time that we felt the Iranians were going to attack the homeland was when the FBI had clear evidence that the Iranians were trying to assassinate a number of American officials and former officials in response or in revenge for the killing of IRGC commander Soleimani. But in that case, and one of the main targets was John Bolton, Trump's former official. Not only did Trump not actually seem interested in the safety of these officials, but he pulled their Secret Service protection. So that reason, the reason of like trying to defend ourselves against Iran cannot possibly stand. And I think the real reason for going to war with Iran now is precisely what I said earlier, which is that at no point in our century has Iran been more fragile than today. So that's precisely what the US and Israel have calculated, they coordinated, probably not just now, but since probably the beginning of Trump's second term in office, to bring this regime to an end. So, this is high stakes international politics. So you kick your opponent the hardest when he is down, which is precisely what this is. It's a very rare opportunity to eliminate Iran as a major regional player in the Middle East for decades to come. Now, some of you will know my background. I work in the field of intelligence, and the job of intelligence professionals, I mean, that's their duty, is to spoil the party, right? So every time a head of state or a decision maker says, I'm going to go do this, what could go wrong? My job is to say, well, there's a long list of what could go wrong, and here's what you have to worry about, right? So we kind of spoil the party in that way. We kind of steal some of the decision space of decision makers because that's our job, to make them think about the things that they haven't thought about while making a decision. And the goal of this exercise is to ensure that in making these decisions, they don't make any catastrophic mistakes, right? So what are the risks? Like what could go wrong here? I think this is the next thing I want to talk about. Now, first I will say that, the hatred, right? The hatred between the White House and the government in Iran, which is visceral, is not unique in the case of the Trump administration. I mean, every post-Cold War U.S. administration, from Bush to Clinton to Obama have had a strong desire to topple the Iranian regime. But that desire for regime change has always coexisted with a recognition, right, of a number of things that could really go seriously wrong. So, for example, there's a very high operational risk here because of the geostrategic complexity of the entire region in which Iran is situated, right? Inflaming tensions in the Gulf, which is the largest concentration of oil and natural gas deposits in the world, right? Inflaming tensions in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, even Pakistan, a nuclear power, and of course Israel. So the military risk of escalation, um, especially if the regime change period is violent and prolonged, um, it it pits not just Iranian forces against each other, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but it could potentially even, and I think we're seeing some early elements of that, escalate to engulf the entire region. So it's like a Libya scenario, but like 10 times worse, right? So in Libya, the scenario was that, you're going to have the pose of Muammar Gaddafi and then you have peace. What you ended up with was basically a fragmented and militarized series of regimes that are fighting each other. And then this destabilization has essentially destabilized all of the Sahel region of Africa. We're talking about the kind of the powers, kind of like Chad, like Mali, like Niger, who all now have a dictatorial pro-Russian governments in power, and that has basically removed all of America's influence from all of North Africa, pretty much. There's also a lot of domestic political constraints within the United States, right? Especially after the debacle of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, I think, the kind of disastrous decision to spend 20 years in inconclusive wars. I mean, it brought the U.S. economy to its knees in 2008. Um, and that's because of the insistence of the White House at the time to go to two foreign wars while actually cutting taxes, which is the first time in history of the world that a country has gone to war while also cutting the revenue coming in from the population to fight the wars, which of course led to the 2008 disaster. It also it made the Republican Party implode. It's basically what created the Tea Party and, of course, the MAGA movement. So that has had effects on American politics that are with us today, very consequential. And one can only wonder what this current war in Iraq is going to bring. And of course, the idea that even if you topple the regime, and we'll talk about this in a minute, you can topple the regime, create a power vacuum in Iran, and you destabilize a region that is very tense. I agree, but there's actually a stability within that tension, right? So it is a stable environment, and stability is far more important in the Middle East than anything else. And of course, the other thing is, and then we'll see how this plays out. There's conflicting views on this one, destabilizing the global energy market, right? So Iran knows that it cannot out escalate, right, the US and Israel. So it's not in a position to fight them equally. This is not a war between equals at all, but it can destabilize the entire Middle East for many years to come. If the war stays limited to Iranian targets, the impact could be relatively minor. But a major war with Iran that spills over to impact shipping, for example, from Gulf states could easily send prices of oil and natural gas, liquid natural gas, skyrocketing, raising costs for consumers, not just in America, but around the world. In a worst case scenario, these spikes, if they're prolonged, could trigger a worldwide recession or at least an economic downturn. So one of the important things that I'd like to clarify here in this discussion is that there's a very, very large difference, in fact, a massive difference between regime change and regime collapse, right? So regime change implies that there is a plan for succession on the part of the attackers, right? So that an initial military attack is designed to bring about not simply the annihilation of the current regime, but its replacement with some kind of a governing structure that will benefit the attackers, right? So what you end up with after the war is something that benefits you as opposed to the opposite, right? But on the other hand, regime collapse is an attack that seeks only to topple a regime and then leave the act of its replacement, the rebuilding, the recovering, to a force that is not directly controlled by the attackers, which is essentially, I think, what we saw both in the case of Iraq, to a lesser extent in Afghanistan, and we all know how those two things ended, right? Regime collapse, so destroying a regime, um, is a relatively easy process for a superpower like the United States. America has an unfathomable military advantage, right? It's also relatively easy to destabilize and destroy regimes of countries where, the governing regime has lost its popular appeal. This is despised by the majority of the population, which is the case with Iran. Um, but regime change is a far more difficult, long-term, and very convoluted task, um, as we discovered both in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan, not to mention Vietnam, South Vietnam back in the days of the Cold War. And I think those who are concerned that the Trump administration doesn't have the patience, the stamina, the intellectual stamina to stick with some kind of plan. I think they're correct to be worried about that. And of course, we all understand that this type of action has, it's amazing how easily we drifted ourselves into war without congressional mandate, without any kind of discussion. I mean, this kind of action, though, is going to be with us for decades to come, right? We have unleashed dynamics in Asia, but also in Europe that may be very difficult to contain, especially in the near future. Let me give an example of this, right? So, what happens if, in response to this, kind of going for the jugular, like, going to immediately, on the first 5 minutes of this war, the US and Israel assassinated the head of state of the enemy, right? What happens if, in response to that, Russia assassinated Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine? Or what happens if tomorrow the Chinese government assassinated or abducted, maybe, the Taiwanese president, right? So Lai Chang-te, who's the current head of state of Taiwan. So I mean, they could say, what's the difference between what you did and what we're doing here, right? So how do you contain that if you are the United States? Now, let's come back here briefly back to the American population and look at the domestic dynamics, right? So I think right now there's a bit of a everybody's sort of like not quite sure what just happened, and everybody's sort of like waiting to see what is going on. There's an argument that I've seen a lot of commentators make, which is that the MAGA movement is very disillusioned by this because the MAGA movement is essentially an America First movement. It's an isolationist movement. It doesn't really have the appetite for foreign wars. And that if you look at all of the things that the Trump Vance ticket was saying in particularly the first term they took as they're running for the first term, as Trump was running with Pence for the first term in office, and also the second term with Vance, you will see that they're very much like allergic almost to wars, foreign wars, and and getting engaged in like being police of the world, and so on and so forth, and that this is going to disillusion the MAGA base. I don't agree with that at all. I think that there are very few MAGA supporters who are ideologically committed to non-intervention and are pure isolationists. I think what the MAGA crowd um, has been reacting viscerally to is losing foreign wars, not just engaging in foreign wars, but losing them, especially in the last 20 years of botched, incredibly expensive and humiliating defeats in countries like Iraq and Afghanistan. The MAGA crowd hates seeing America humiliated by lesser powers, who what they want is not necessarily not to be involved in foreign wars, but they want to win and they want to win fast. They want immediate gratification. And I think, if this Iran situation is one such victory, I think that's actually going to please the MAGA crowd. It's actually going to make it, in fact, even more happy with Trump, right? It's going to add to Trump's domestic popularity. But if this is a prolonged battle, a messy crisis in what is arguably the most volatile region in the world, then we might end up, or Trump might end up in a potentially destructive gamble, arguably the most dangerous gamble of his entire career and his entire legacy. Now let's come back to Iran, right? Iran, and I'm going to send Sami a couple of things that I've written in the last couple of years. My students and I have written a very extensive report about what happens if the current, if the one that just died, the supreme leader dies, who would take over? And that makes a good read. We wrote it a year ago, and it's very, very relevant now, of course. And I've also written a bit about with another student of mine, or two students of mine, an article that was published in a peer-reviewed journal about the Iranian opposition and the state of that. And I'm going to send this to Sami to distribute to the group. Now, Iran is often referred to as an Islamic republic, but in reality, this is only nominally the case, right? In reality, only about 5% of the population regularly attend mosques. Most young people are secular. I mean, the entire Islamic, image is a facade, basically, not much different to Saudi Arabia, where, it's kind of like a reason that it allows an elite of wealthy and powerful men to rule the country in the case of Iran, for almost 100 million people with a very strict iron fist. The supreme leader that was killed on the first opening salvos of the war is more of a figurehead, right? It's a religious cleric who plays a very small role in tactical decisions involving military matters. The Guardian Council is comprised of 12 members, six Islamic clerics, and six legislative jurists, which are appointed by the Supreme Leader, but also some of the jurists, the six jurists, are appointed by the Iranian parliament, basically. And the Assembly of Experts, which is a body of 88 kind of senior regime bureaucrats, and is tasked It only meets when it needs to select a new supreme leader. Okay. And two-thirds of that, of 88 people, must vote to approve the next supreme leader. What's interesting is that, as I'm seeing on some posts this morning, the Assembly of Experts met in Qom, which is the most sacred religious location in Iran. It has a theological seminary where all the most eminent mullahs of Iran have graduated from. And I think Israel actually bombed this morning the gathering of these experts, and I'm not sure if they were killed or what happened. But that again, that shows you there's no red lines left in this war. This is a war to the end. This is a war for life or death, right? But what really matters is not so much these kind of clerical and bureaucratic groups or bodies. It's the military. It's the guys with the guns. And in that case, we have two factors here, major actors. The Artesh, which is the Iranian military, uh, not it's very large. It's something like 400,000 armed men and women, but they don't have nearly the power of the IRGC, as I mentioned, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is basically a kind of paramilitary organization of about 150,000 troops that has developed kind of like a Praetorian Guard of the regime, the most loyal, the most hardcore, the most committed, armed kind of wing of the regime. And it's there essentially to ensure that the revolution of 1979 retains its ideological purity. They have an army, a navy, they have elite air force, they have elite paramilitary, like special forces troops and what have you. That is probably the key here in terms of what happens next. Unfortunately, there's no organized opposition inside the country, right? There are some liberal reformers here and there. For example, the former prime minister that you keep hearing now in the news, Mir Hosseini Mousavi. You have the former interior minister, Mustafa Tajidadeh. But these are both, at least the last I heard, under house arrest. There's the Women Freedom Life movement that had the most recent uprisings of students in Iran in the last couple of years. But that's mostly a kind of a social media movement. Right now, Iran has shut down the internet, so it's very difficult for young people to organize and to kind of move toward a mass resistance. And there's also a couple of interesting actors outside Iran, but they're very, very weak. One of them, of course, is the son of the former king, Reza Pahlavi, whom some of you know escaped to the United States in '79 and died here shortly afterwards. His son has stated that he wants to unite these people. He's been very vague about this. And I will say, though, that there's very few, really very few supporters of the old king. I mean, one thing about Pahlavi, the king of Iran from 56 to 79, that makes him different to the current regime is that Pahlavi was even more detested, right? So that's the one thing to remember about Pahlavi. And so very few people actually are supporters of him inside Iran. And then you have this really weird group called the People's Mujahideen of Iran, which I've written about extensively, also known as the MEK. And that is a group that began as a Marxist Islamist organization of students. So it combined Islam and Marxism in the 1960s, participated in the 1979 uprising against the king, but then was exiled by the theocratic regime and now is based in Albania, of all countries, and in France. And he set up a group called the National Council of Resistance of Iran. It is a very strange group, even though it's a Marxist group. Many Trump officials have gotten close to it lately. But what's interesting about this group is that it is basically running itself as a bit of a cult. where the leader of the group, it's a married couple, and they're seen as basically prophets by Muhammad, and it's a very strange place. You're not allowed to marry outside the group, and it's just a very, very weird thing. They have no presence really inside Iran of any kind of seriousness. So that's it. There's no other opposition because the regime has done a very good job of destroying the opposition in the last 50 to 60 years. So let me finish with an assessment, and then we can move on to Q&A and discussion as per Sami's request. So I'm going to make some assessments and some predictions here, and this is kind of like the main juice of the whole my whole kind of comments. The first one is here's some good. Let's make some good news. The good news is that Iran and its proxies are very weak, right? They are they're very unlikely to be able to cause any kind of widespread damage in the Middle East or even further afield. Like some people were very worried when the British bases in Cyprus were attacked yesterday and the day before yesterday. Let me remind you that Cyprus is European soil and a member of the European Union. That's the first time Iran has ever attacked directly with drones the European Union soil, and that used to be a red line. Now it has been crossed. So again, all evidence points to this being a fight to the death, right? But you know, uh, you know, I would have been a lot more worried had this been going on, say, 2 years ago or 3 years ago versus now, because like I said, Iran is very weak right now. And the other good news is that Iran is not going to be able to match American Israeli military might. This is again not a fight between equals. But that's the end of the good news. The bad news are a lot more than the good news. The bad news is that the ability of the United States and Israel to ensure a pro-Western or pro-US outcome in Iran solely through air power, no matter how sophisticated the air power is severely limited. The fact about air campaigns is that they can destroy things, but what they cannot do by themselves is reorder domestic politics and be able to build political outcomes. That's the first bad news. The second piece of bad news is that bombing Iran again is relatively easy. I mean, what comes next, however, is not very easy at all. It's going to get extremely bloody. Again, the Iranian regime, I think all evidence points to the fact that the Iranian regime believes it is fighting for its very survival. So it's very unlikely to capitulate. It has everything to lose. It has no incentive to hold anything back. And I think that those who believe that this is going to last 4 to 5 weeks are fooling themselves. Unless, of course, Trump loses interest and moves on to something else while declaring victory, but leaving things basically an unfinished mess, which is likely to happen. So yes, the if you look at remember the phases I talked to you about earlier, removing capabilities, right? So using air power to remove the capabilities of the Iranian regime is may be able to work, but that's not the same, and I really want to stress this, as managing the political fallout, right? So even if a popular revolt does transpire, by the way, we haven't seen that yet. All we've seen so far in Iran is a few muted celebrations of the killing of Ayatollah Khamenei, but we've mostly seen actually demonstrations in support of the regime, right? Not against it. But even if a popular revolt were to transpire, it's very difficult to see how it could eventually effectuate any kind of political change. Right? Remember that, as I told you, the domestic opposition of Iran, such as it is, it's neither organized nor is it experienced in armed fighting. The guys with the guns, the IRGC, are so solidly committed to the regime. Now, what is more likely to happen, I think, is that the regime is more likely to experience some kind of pushback in its periphery. And I mean by that locations in the periphery where there's ethnic groups that want to secede. And I think that would be a lot easier to see than some kind of urban uprising by students, um, Kurdistan, Balochistan, but that again is left to be seen. I personally, and I want to make this prediction today, I do not see the regime falling anytime soon. I think it's going to be with us at least until 2027 and maybe in the future as well. I think the regime, in some shape or form, even if it is sort of makes some concessions to the United States and to Israel, is going to remain in power in some shape or form until for at least another year, if not longer. And of course, if the regime falls, um, that is the eventuality of say being, let's say it's replaced, right, by some group or other, again, unlikely prospect, but it could happen. The It is unlikely for such a replacement regime to be friendly to the United States or to the West or to Israel, right? Remember that Iran has a political culture that is shaped by revolution, by nationalism, by this kind of long-lasting narrative of resistance to foreign intervention that goes back 100 years. I mean, the regime, specifically this regime, since 79, has spent the last half century calling the US the Great Satan, embedding this identity into institutions, education, the internal security structure. I mean, even anti-regime Iranians believe in core elements of this narrative, right? Even the people who are celebrating for the killing of the supreme leader 3 days ago, it doesn't mean they like the United States. That's an important statement to make, right? They can both hate the regime and hate the United States. The two things are not mutually exclusive. And let me close with this, and I think this is really the worst news, really, or potentially the worst news, which is this, that the Russians and the Chinese, in my view, they can't believe their luck. I mean, not only has the US failed to stop Russia's war in Europe. Remember that Trump ran on this promise that he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours, right? Not only has the US fragmented NATO and driven countries that used to be American allies into the arms of China, countries like Canada, for example, and Britain, but it's now prospectively, and we'll see how this plays out, prospectively bogged down into yet another war in the Middle East. Last time the US did that, it destroyed its economy, leading to the 2008 economic crash. It fragmented politics in America, leading to the rise of populism because of this economic crash. It brought about the Tea Party, the MAGA movement. It appended American politics for decades to come. So one can only wonder what is next in store for this rapidly declining superpower that we refer to as the United States of America.